Hello and welcome back to part two of my discussion with Dr. Filippo Costa-Brunelli, a leading academic on Central Asia, on the ever-growing significance of the region in geopolitics today. In the last episode, we discussed Central Asia's importance as a region, the changing influence of Russia after their invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and the increasing presence of China. In part two, we discussed the C5+1 framework and its importance for Central Asian foreign policy, as well as the resilience of authoritarian behaviors and their relationship with Azerbaijan. This interview and project is supported by the Democratic Security Institute, an international think tank dedicated to advancing peace, democracy, human rights, and conflict resolution across some of the world's most complex regions. So I hope you enjoy part two. So if in the next maybe like 5 or 10 years, how do you see that relationship changing, this kind of balancing between Russian and Chinese influence? In 5 years' time, do you see China being the dominant partner in all sectors, or are they just in one way and Russia will always be there? Like, how do you see those relationships developing?
That's a very good question, and I should tell the audience I don't have any crystal ball with me. Even such a short period of time is difficult to assess. Maybe I will chicken out a little bit, and I will say something very diplomatic. I do not see a massive overhaul of relations. I tend to see relations as developing steadily. China may be consolidating its footprint, but being very cautious in not curtailing Central Asian agency, and in keeping in mind that at least nominally, the security of the region lies in the hand of, the governments and of Russia in terms of great power management. But at the same time, I believe we will observe a more kind of stable, not stable, but kind of long-lasting presence in Central Asia of China, especially if Afghanistan enters the picture. Afghanistan is already entering the picture in trade terms, in security terms. There is a very important platform that is not guiltily talked about enough, the name of which is the Termez Dialogue. And it's a yearly kind of happening where neighboring countries engage Afghanistan in diplomacy. Regional organizations are involved as well. So the OAC is also, I think they were there. Their delegation was there last week, 2 weeks ago. But because of its economic and infrastructural interest and security interest in Afghanistan, China has a stake in all this. So here we go back to the beginning of this conversation, right? When I said that the contours of the region may change. So if Afghanistan enters the picture, I would expect China to be a little bit more present. And nowadays, because of the kind of connectivity that Central Asia is seeking to kind of steer and own, okay, in terms of transit, from China to Europe, and this is why Azerbaijan is being kind of engaged. Well, China has a very strong interest in helping Central Asia keeping itself stable and pursuing sustainable development. When it comes to green energy as well and energy transition, the big players in Central Asia are the Gulf states, especially Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, but China. Once again, it's China. Russia cannot care less for energy transition. They invest in nuclear, okay? But that's a controversial thing, okay? Whether nuclear counts as part of the whole energy. Russia is poised to lose more influence, I believe. Its political capital has been eroded. Its economic capital has been eroded. Trade turnover is great with Kazakhstan, mostly because of geographical proximity. Other countries that, like Kyrgyzstan or Tajikistan, that rely a lot on remittances and kind of export of workforce, are already looking for alternative destinations because of the kind of racism that these people experience when they go to Russia to work. And let's not forget that these people, there are now very credible reports that basically trace and describe how Central Asian migrants are lured to Russia with the promise of a job and then they're sent to the front.
Yeah, yeah. I also wanted to ask about the C5+1 as a model or a diplomatic platform for the Central Asian states to engage in dialogue or cooperation with other global powers. Um, and obviously, you have had a role as a senior advisor to the MFA, the Italian MFA. How do you see the Italy Central Asia 5+1 format, and how does that differ from the other 5+1s? So, if you could just give a brief explanation about what it is initially, and then how the Italian one differs.
Of course. So the 5+1, it's a diplomatic format that stands for Central Asia Plus. Okay. Um, and it was first launched by Japan. So Japan was the first country back in the early 2000s to create this platform to engage the region, focusing especially on economic, cultural, and educational and technological matters. Okay. Um, After that, many other states, looking at the success of the formula, wanted their own C5+1. And there is now a C5+1 with the US, with China, with Russia, with India, with South Korea, with Germany. The UK had its first one this year or last year, the level of foreign ministry, and with Italy as well. Oh, Italy was the first European country in 2019 to create the 5+1 format, and then other European countries followed suit. Now, this platform is, you can read it in two ways. On the one hand, you can say that it's for the Central Asian states to diversify what is called their multi-vectoral foreign policy. Okay. And that basically it's for them to seek economic and political partners to attract investments, to attract businesses, and to basically put themselves on the map, forging diplomatic relations with middle and great powers as a region, as a bloc. Yeah? Which is a word I don't like much because Central Asia doesn't describe itself as a bloc, but it gives you the metaphorical kind of image. The other way of reading it is that these 5+1s are actually created following the demand of the +1, not of the 5. So the C5+1 is a very interesting example of the kind of external creation of a region. So the 1 identifies the 5 as a region and kind of suggests this kind of interregional cooperation format in a hybrid format, because it's not region to region, it's one state plus region. And the Central Asian states are, of course, eager to have this, but there are also a couple of cracks in the picture. And one of them is because the Central Asian states are so different and so diverse among each other, the 5+1 always starts on the premise of equality, and that Central Asia like a block, as I said, where everyone reaps the same benefits. But oftentimes the 5+1 ends up being a 2+1 because Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan have the lion's share.
Yeah.
Okay, because of their economic endowment, because of their energy resources, because of the kind of powerhouse, that role that they have in Central Asia. And this is why, for example, whenever I speak to diplomats from other Central Asian countries, the 5+1 is looked at a little bit with caution. You know, oh, we're happy to do that because we sit with our brotherly neighbors, we coordinate and the like. And we also see who wants what. But in terms of results, then not always everyone gets something. Okay. So they travel for these meetings and they come back having attended a good meeting with a promise of investment, but maybe the investment doesn't come at all or the volume is much lower. Now, this is the picture of what the 5+1 is. The Italian 5+1 tries to rectify all this. And exactly because Italy is not a great power and is not a big power, you may define Italy as some sort of middle power. It is a G7 economy. It's a state that, despite a chronic public debt, which is mostly state debt, by the way, families are much more responsible. is stable in economic and financial terms, has a very good export. It has, of course, a very good deal of soft power due to culture, due to tourism, education, the resilience of small and medium-sized enterprises. Um, Italy, according to its constitution, rejects war as an instrument of foreign policy and international relations. These are all things that the Central Asian republics like. And therefore, I can tell you from within that the 5+1 with Italy is based not necessarily on big investments. Okay. We are not talking about billions. Italy doesn't have that. Or if they have those, they are earmarked on other things. Italy cannot speak of big infrastructural projects. Okay? If it does so, it's because it is part of the European Union. Eh? But Italy speaks of people to people cooperation. Italy speaks of small and medium sized enterprises. Italy speaks of education. Italy speaks about policy making and training. So, one of the projects I recently worked on with people at the MFA and other colleagues, especially Carlo Frappi at the University of Venice, is the launch of these schools of policies for members of the administrative academies of public administration in Central Asia, where basically the next generation of state bureaucrats and admin personnel is forged, right? So we have invited them, 80 people in total, okay, 16 for each Central Asia republics, to 4 different schools. One about water and health, one about energy, one about connectivity, and one about agriculture. And these 80 people receive training for free. Everything is paid for. And they go back to the country to which they belong, their respective homeland, with the training about the best and next practices. And so not just the best practices, but the next practices, those that will be useful in the future, about those 4 domains. And the universities involved are Bologna, University of the Tuscia, University of Milan, University of Rome, okay, and University of Venice, of course. And they receive training not just from academics, but also from people in the private sector as well. So the Italian railway company will offer free training to them on the importance of, for example, investments in infrastructure, this kind of stuff. But exactly because Italy values reciprocity as well and starts the 5+1 on the basis of equality, we also suggested that in the second part of the schools of policy, the Central Asian republics will host workshops for Italian public administrators. And so in the autumn, public administrators will travel to Central Asia to be trained by Central Asian specialists. And this is working very well. Italy emphasizes respect. Italy emphasizes sovereignty, non-interference. Italy, of course, as a member of the European Union, has a willingness, but also a role in fostering human rights, good governance, and democratic credentials. Italy is also aware that, this is a process in which other things can happen. And this kind of people-to-people kind of diplomacy and training is one of the best ways to advance dialogue and to accumulate political capital. So it's working pretty well. I was in Turkmenistan 1.5 years ago to discuss this project. We traveled to all the other Central Asian republics because it starts from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but then it goes down at the level of people. Which is absolutely great. And I will stop by saying that this kind of cooperation culminated in the joint declaration of the heads of states and governments 1 year ago in Astana, the capital of Kazakhstan, where the 5 Central Asian presidents and the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni signed the first joint declaration after a 5+1 with a European country. And in this joint declaration, in one of the paragraphs, the importance for people-to-people contacts, especially in the kind of what we call knowledge networks, is reiterated. And that was for us the starting point for the, bless you, the school. Okay, so this is the kind of work we are doing.
So you kind of mentioned that obviously as part of this kind of transmission of knowledge and ideas and exchange of people, is that Italy will be providing advice or education on promotion of human rights, democratic structures. But as you mentioned in the beginning, this is an area that's traditionally been considered just governed by a bunch of autocrats. How do you see that developing? Because I feel a lot of your work kind of focuses on how these states maintain resilient authoritarian regimes, and as a region, they keep each other alive. So how does that relationship work? Is it foreseeable that they will start to introduce democratic reforms or uphold human rights at a greater standard than before?
Yeah. So that's a very good question. Before answering, just a small point of clarification. So Italy emphasizes those values because it believes in it, and it's as a European country. That's the kind of world order Italy stands for. But exactly because of the difficulties you mentioned, to which we are now moving, Italy and other states also understand that, if you cannot consider them as preconditions, consider them as goals, keep working towards those goals, but in the meanwhile, work on projects that can nonetheless advance the well-being and the good governance of the states. Okay? So this is the kind of compromise, if you wish, that several 5+1 formats with Western states are advancing. Now, having clarified this, you're right. Much of my work uses the concept of institutionalization of authoritarianism. And by this, I mean that authoritarianism is not just a trait or a characteristic of the domestic politics of each state of Central Asia, but over the years, it has become almost as a shared regional standard of combat. So it's not enough to say, oh, those states are authoritarian. It's more accurate to say those states embrace an authoritarian understanding of politics and regional order. So the crucial element here is that authoritarianism is not just the result of the willingness of the regime to stay in power at all costs, but it's an unwritten rule that somehow defines how regional politics should be conducted. Okay? And this is why in my work, I emphasize that authoritarianism is not just a political element, it is a practice. And as a practice, it has a behavioral component and it has a discursive component. And these components are rooted in very clear ideas of what is right and what is wrong, what is desirable, what is undesirable, what is good and what is shameful. So whenever a Central Asian state suppresses protests, whenever a Central Asian state returns to a neighboring country somebody who was looking for political asylum due to persecution, whenever a Central Asian state carries out a political reform that, for example, will inevitably, albeit indirectly perhaps, entrench the power of the incumbent, that's not just a domestic thing. That is a regional thing. They do praise each other. They say, well done. They pat each other's back. I was discussing recently with a diplomat from a Central Asian country the recent authoritarian turn of the Kyrgyz Republic that until recently was hailed in the West as a beacon of democracy. And in the last 5 years, it has really gone down an authoritarian path. And guess what this Central Asian diplomat told me? Okay, I'm quoting, they are learning. Now, not only you learn something because it's good for you. So you have already the good and bad dimension. Okay. But when you say they are learning, you are inevitably looking at authoritarianism as a social practice because you mean you observe, you mean you take notes, metaphorically, right? It means that you understand that is good for you from a broader context where that practice is accepted and you are not patronized. So when they say they are learning, or I can mention another diplomat who was commenting on how a political refugee was returned to another country for trial. They said our neighbors helped. Okay, that's another very discursively speaking, for those of our audience who are familiar with discourse analysis, that's a very strong statement. They're learning, they are helping. So going back to your question, no, I don't see in the foreseeable future a sudden democratization of Central Asia. We may see some patchwork liberalization in some sector of the economy and in some political domains, like protection for women or a little bit more of relaxation in terms of gender equality, or a little bit of relaxation in voting rights or in conducting elections a little bit more in line with Western standards.
Hmm.
But we are forgetting that this part of the world has its own standards, has its own practice. And I'm not condoning authoritarianism because of this, but what I'm saying is that it's not just a domestic, capricious practice. It's a much broader socio-political context in which this is validated. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Community of Independent States, they do send their own observers. It's not just the European Union that sends observers. There are other observers as well that validate rigged elections.
Yeah.
So Central Asia understands they cannot just do what they want. And because of the kind of legitimacy they need at the international community level, they do have to speak the language of good governance and democracy. And they do have to signal that something is happening.
Yeah.
But as I say in my work, authoritarianism is not just present, it's institutionalized. It means that it's self-reproducing through social practices that are validated. And therefore, I wrote that article that is published in International Studies Quarterly in 2020. And in the final parts of that article, I cautioned the reader about Kyrgyzstan. Okay? And look at where we are now. Now, I hate to say I was right because we are speaking of a context where civil liberties are progressively.
Yeah.
But somehow my work theoretically indicated that if that was the case, then we had good expectations in terms of expecting Kyrgyzstan to follow that path. And I don't blame just, the leaders and the Eurasian great powers. Western investors, honestly, benefit from stability. You don't want your investments spoiled, right? By protests so everyone is a little bit complicit here. Some people less than others, but an authoritarian and stable Central Asia serves many purposes of many people.
Mhm.
Okay?
I would suppose that would be similar to people's arguments for Azerbaijan, that
Mhm.
um, and I suppose that is potentially one of the reasons why people associate Azerbaijan with Central Asia. Do you see that relationship developing, especially from like an energy and connectivity perspective, like on an alternative route for energy that bypasses Russia and Iran, but would link Central Asia, China, the South Caucasus, and Europe? Do you see this relationship between Central Asia and Azerbaijan developing?
Yeah. The short answer is yes, absolutely. It's not just connectivity and trade. Azerbaijan, historically speaking, has been sharing a lot with Central Asia in terms of culture, in terms of history, in terms of mentality, certainly religion, but also in terms of what I call in my work cosmology, right? Which is a big and fanciful word, but it ultimately means vision of the world, okay? The way in which politics is understood, society is understood, the economy is understood, and the like. And I was doing research in the archives in Uzbekistan for my book, which I call the Schrodinger's book because it is there, but it's never there. Right? I never managed to finish it, so I will have to finish it soon. But I was doing research in the archives in Tashkent, and I found um, a very interesting folder where the transcripts of dialogues in the Ministry of Culture of Uzbekistan were typed. And the whole discussion was about the festival of Nowruz, okay, which is the Persian Zoroastrian kind of celebration of the new year, which in other parts of the world is associated with the beginning of spring. Is renovation. And the whole discussion, guess what, was about now we are independent. That folder was from the 1992 year. Now we are independent. What should we do for Nowruz? And different theater unions, poet unions from Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan were discussing this. And the bone of contention was, shall we invite the Azeris? Because we share so much with them. right? So for me, that was eye-opening because I already started connecting the dots. Like this emphasis on Azerbaijan nowadays is nothing new. It started already in the 1990s, and I have archival materials to prove that. And this is why I have to publish, the book that I have those materials. But all this preamble is just to say that discourses about Azerbaijan being part of the region are not new. Okay, they exist at 30 plus years. Now, I do see the relations developing because for the past 3 consultative meetings, the president of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, um, has been attending the consultative meetings of presidents of Central Asia. It started in Dushanbe in 2024. Then he attended Astana in 2025 as a guest of honor on both occasions. In 2026, no, sorry, I'm getting the dates wrong. 2023 Dushanbe, Astana 2024, guest of honor. In 2025, in Tashkent, Azerbaijan, therefore Aliyev, were admitted as full members of the consultative meetings of Central Asian Set of States. And this is why some people now are talking about Central Asia not as C5, but C6. Right. Now, I have interesting stories about this, also coming from the C5+1 perspective, about how much clarity is still needed to make sense of this. Okay. The message of the C5 plus or C6 plus is still a little bit ambiguous. We are not there yet, but this is maybe for another conversation. Going back to your question, relations are developing a lot. As we are speaking today, the president of Turkmenistan is on a state visit to Baku in Azerbaijan. And this is very important because it follows a letter that the father of the current president of Turkmenistan, former president of Turkmenistan, sent to Aliyev last year on the occasion of its admission to the consultative meetings, where basically Turkmenistan takes the ownership of the idea of including Azerbaijan in the Central Asian format. Why is it important? Because Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan historically didn't have very good relations because of Caspian Sea politics, because of transit, because of energy resources and the like. It seems that now those relations are, those kind of frictions are buried in the past. Relations are now super. And now that was the missing link, because if now Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan speak, this means there can be good cooperation at the Trans-Caspian level. There have been very interesting examples of trilateral diplomacy. Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan at the same table. Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan at the same table. There are problems as well. Central Asian ports, for example, do not have all this capacity for transit. So if the northern route is blocked, and if the north-south corridor is still being developed, and if the middle corridor is the only possible solution, then we need a lot more of investments in port capacity, for example. It's very easy to say, oh, we act as a transit. You can't if you don't have ports that are able to manage the kind of... There are lots of, how do you call them? Not hiccups, but when basically the transit routes are clogged. Is there a specific word?
When the transit routes are
like clogged or like filled up. When the traffic slows down because you have too much goods accumulating.
Well, when it gets narrower.
Yeah.
Like it's like a bottleneck.
Bottleneck, that's the word.
Yeah.
The bottleneck. Thank you for that. So there are lots of bottlenecks as well. And plus, you need also to get on board other Caucasian states. Turkey as well. So it's not over. And on Caucasian transit diplomacy, it's very important because I think in hindsight, the resolution of the Nagorno-Karabakh war had something to do with this kind of movements of transconnectivity. Then you add the Zangezur corridor, the Trump route for peace. There are people now suggesting a C3 format, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia. It may be too early for that, but in the future, it may be a good idea to coordinate efforts in transit and connectivity. Now, relations with Azerbaijan, I think, I don't want to say stop there, because there are also humanitarian relations, political relations, cultural relations. But I think it's fair to say that at the moment, Central Asia, Azerbaijani relations are mostly about connectivity, trade, and energy. It's very businesslike in a good way, but it's the identitarian component, if you wish. It's played down a little bit.
Yeah.
It's when this was announced, there were a few articles in the press. Oh, like Central Asia is now a new geopolitical realm. Azerbaijan is now fully part of Central Asia. You can see how that has already waned out a little bit. Okay? But the connectivity and energy elements have stayed.
Okay, perfect. So I just have a few more questions. What do you think the most common misconception of Central Asia is?
Well, I have a few in mind. I would say one of the most commons is the stance. Um, I get, shivers. I get the creeps every time somebody says the stance because I understand is a very useful shortcut to strike an image in somebody's mind who doesn't know that part of the world. I travel to the stance, but that has an implicit derogatory meaning. And it lumps together a lot of very different realities, um, histories and stories. Okay, ways of livings, um, ways of doing politics, of running an economy. It's the stance has also an implicit, again, danger dimension. The stance um, is often associated to some sort of Orientalism. The stans are this dark, mysterious, uh, feminine part of the world that is yet to be explored and maybe civilized. Eh? And who's part of the stans, by the way? Is it also Pakistan, Afghanistan? Is it Tatarstan? Right? Other parts of that macro area can be included potentially in the stans. And it sounds a little bit like a misplaced adventurism that considers Central Asia as a black hole that is not at all. Um, but I do, in all fairness, I do understand the value of the metaphor for somebody who really doesn't know the area. Okay?
Mm.
The other misconception, and then I stop, it's the new great game. It's this idea that Central Asian states, because they are small, weak, remote, if not peripheral, still emerging and sandwiched between great powers, they are the prize of what is called the new great game between great powers, right? And this is a metaphor that goes back to Kipling. Okay? I think the book was Heart of Darkness.
Yeah.
But it's so this idea of the new great game that somebody has to win and Central Asia is the prize. I mean, I spent my whole research disproving this. And my doctorate started in the early 2010s. So it means that it's been more than a decade that I've been working against this. It's a metaphor that really silences and belittles the success stories of Central Asia that are a lot, frankly speaking. Uh, do you know that Central Asia is the only nuclear weapon free zone in the Northern Hemisphere? Between nuclear powers, by the way. And
Mhm.
they did that, by themselves with the help of the international community, but they decided themselves to do. They avoided interstate war. They are, responsible members of the United Nations systems now proposing resolutions on terminating wars and pursuing peace. They have embraced, perhaps a little bit more rhetorically than other formats, but the sustainable development agenda. Um, they emphasize, dialogue as a means for resolving conflict. So, in the region, there may be a lot of things we do not like. Again, authoritarianism, corruption, illiberal practices. There are pockets of poverty that this idea of the Central Asian economic miracle is not addressing. There are several areas of chronic capitalism marring the region. And but this idea of the new great game doesn't help fixing. Okay, Central Asia has now its own agency consolidated. My research points at the fact that this agency has always been there. Okay, but let's focus on this moment that now this agency is more visible. if you wish. It's more visible, it's more tangible, and I think the new Great Game narrative is not only inaccurate but also inappropriate. Just it doesn't shed any light on the international politics of Central Asia. If anything, it obscures more than clarifies.
And my last question would be if you have any book recommendations. It could be about Central Asia, not about Central Asia. Anything that you're reading at the moment that you would
In
recommend?
terms of reading books, resources. Well, of course, all of my articles.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I'm joking, of course. But for those of you interested in the intra-regional and international relations of Central Asia, um, most of my articles are open access online. And of course, I can be contacted and I'm happy to provide PDFs. I mentioned Backlash before by Lemon and Jardine. There is some very, very good work produced on the kind of post-colonial and decolonial turn in Central Asia by scholars such as Diana Kudai-Bergen, Erika Marat, Botakos Kasimbekova. I am a great fan of the historical work done by Adib Khalid that basically traces Central Asia all the way back to the Persian and Arab and nomadic empires down in history. Um, I mean, there is some very good and useful work done at the, talking about energy politics by Ali Atzkai. Relations with the European Union, Zhani Bekarinov is a very good scholar to follow. There are also very important, I would say, works that I have enjoyed a lot at the anthropological political geography level on border communities. If we are speaking of local scholars, Asel Mirzakulova is a scholar to follow, and Nick McGoran is one of the points of references. It's been one for more than 2 decades now. So plenty really of resources. More and more books are published. Really, I can mention Timur Dadabayev, Farkhod Tolipov, Iqbal John Kolaboyev. Um, but also, what is encouraging is that a lot of now, I mentioned a few of them, but female scholars from Central Asia are getting their voices heard as well. Madina Gazieva, who has finished recently her PhD in Dublin, has done some very important work on transboundary communities and water politics in Central Asia. And Karolina Kluchevska has done very important work on international organizations and Tajikistan. So
Mhm.
there's a whole literature out there to be discovered. And guess what? None of those works is about the new Great Game.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. That was so interesting. I've written like 5 pages of notes during this
Thank you.
conversation.
And sorry if, I took my time to elaborate on some of the answers, but
No,
this is
totally. It's
also
so
interesting.
interesting. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye bye.